poll. How many of you never really heard about the story of Deborah? How many of you have never read this passage from the book of Judges? Or maybe you haven't even read the book of Judges. How many of you have never heard a sermon preached on Deborah? Yeah, look around you. I grew up in the church, and among all the many sermons I have heard preached in my days, I don't remember a single one focused on this fascinating, powerful woman from the Hebrew Bible, and what a shame that is. Now, I think there's several possible reasons for this. First of all, there's sexism and patriarchy. It's big ones, yeah. Now, I bet you're familiar with one of the stories from Judges. I bet you know the story of Samson and Delilah. Yeah. Patriarchy is pretty accustomed to highlighting scandalous women as temptresses, but patriarchy doesn't always know how to approach a strong, competent woman who takes charge and leaves their male counterparts in the dust, or in this case, leaves their male counterparts asleep with a tent peg stuck in his skull. That's the story of Yael. Also, the book of Judges is really problematic, especially to modern mainline progressive Christians. It's full of violence, with a God that seems judgmental and oppressive rather than loving. It's a hard work to read, and it's a hard one to preach. Since very few people, including the preachers, have studied the book much, it takes a lot of prep work and teaching to prepare a sermon on it, and it's hard to find good news in this story, in a book that by the end of it devolves into chaos and depravity. Finally, and this is probably related to the problematic nature of the book of Judges, the book barely appears in the Revised Common Lectionary. So the Revised Common Lectionary is a 3-year cycle of 4 biblical readings for each Sunday, one from the Hebrew Bible, one from the Psalms, one from the 4 Gospels, and one reading from letters of Paul or other books of the New Testament. And so if you read all of these every Sunday or preach from them, you've pretty much covered most of the major stories in the Bible. And the readings illuminate the church seasons and, follow along with Advent and Lent and that sort of thing. And many mainline preachers use the Revised Common Lectionary as a place to start for choosing scripture for sermons. Jeff and I often do, although more and more we've been creating our own lectionary and creating sermon series that we think are relevant and interesting for issues of our day, like this series about women in the Bible. But in the Revised Common Lectionary, a reading from the book of Judges appears only once in the entire 3-year cycle. It is at least the story of Deborah, but it's only the first 7 verses of chapter 4, which doesn't complete the narrative. It kind of sets up the story, and then it doesn't finish it. So it's a wonder, given all of this, no wonder that most preachers take a look at the lectionary. Deborah, I'm going to choose to read the gospel lesson today. And do the story of the talents from Matthew, which is the gospel reading for the same day. Now, I know you've heard a few sermons on the story of the talents from the gospel according to Matthew. The servants bury the talents in the ground, that one. Yeah, you've heard that one. So, given all of this and the violence in the book and the problematic nature of Judges, why bother reading it at all? Why not set it aside and focus on the books that seem to have more relevance for our time, or focus on the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus? Well, I'm going to argue that Judges is actually relevant for our times and well worth our attentive reading. So consider this list of issues. Tension and strife between rival groups. Disputes over land and territory. Uncertainty over the roles of men and women. Power-hungry political leaders. Child and spouse abuse. Senseless and excessive violence. Male political leaders who chase women. Excessive individualism. Moral confusion. Social chaos. What time and place does this list describe? We could say that this is the state of the world we find ourselves here in the early 21st century United States. And it is, in fact, a pretty thorough description of the contents of the book of Judges. And while our world is considerably different from the world of those who lived over 3,000 years ago, human nature hasn't changed much. The world may have changed dramatically and human civilization may have come a long way, but the book of Judges is a timely reminder of how far we have not come. Now, we may dismiss the violent battles in Judges, and there are a lot of them, as vestiges of a bygone era, but in doing so, we forget that the 20th century was the most violent 100 years in human history. Think about it. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, school shootings, just had another one. Considering the fact that we have been at war in Afghanistan for 18 years, this century isn't looking to reverse the trend. Dismissing Judges as just a collection of barbaric stories from a primitive and relatively uncivilized time is both a disservice to the book of Judges and to ourselves. Because Judges explores issues that are of perennial importance for the human community and especially for people of faith. How do we achieve justice and peace among human beings who seem inevitably self-centered and self-assertive? How do we resist the temptation to worship the idols of our world and return to the covenant we have with a God who will not, indeed cannot, stop loving a persistently idolatrous and frustratingly faithless people? The last few chapters of the book where the world dissolves into a chaos of terror and brutal violence are a reminder to us of what happens when a people stray farther and farther from their spiritual center. It may be that our reluctance to study the book of Judges reveals a reluctance to look inside our own society in our own time and face our own violence and faithlessness. And that may be one of the best reasons to confront this book and come to terms with it. Another reason to study Judges, of course, is that it tells the story of two incredibly strong, smart, focused, and brave women, Deborah and Yael. And it tells those stories, as Joy mentioned, it tells those stories without apologizing for or diminishing them at all because of their gender. It just acknowledges that they are women, and there's nothing to apologize for about that. In fact, the way these stories are recounted here in Judges suggests that women may have been more active in leadership than the ancient literature suggests. Recent scholarship suggests that the time period that Judges describes, roughly the period of 1200 to 1000 before the Common Era, may actually have been radically egalitarian, at least in Israel, in the people of Israel. Historians of this period describe Israelite society in this time as one in which women and men worked together in small family units to squeeze out a subsistence level existence in the hill country of Canaan. And in this pre-monarchy period, it was possible for a woman like Deborah to play a major administrative and religious role in the life of early Israel. As Joy mentioned, in the narrative history of ancient Israel, the time period of Judges falls between the stories of Exodus, Moses, Joshua entering the Promised Land, and the unification of the 12 tribes of Israel under the monarchy established by Saul, David, and Solomon. In between those two narratives lies this time of transition and disorganization as the Israelite people try and fail and try again to govern themselves and to keep the covenant that Moses established with God. And this trying and failing takes a particular pattern in the book of Judges. So the people try for a while, but they fail to keep their covenant with God, and they do evil, as the Bible calls it, by worshiping idols, worshiping other gods. We have other gods too that we worship. God gets angry and frustrated with them, and he allows the people to be oppressed by one of the many stronger and more powerful communities around them, the Canaanites, the Midianites, the Moabites. Everybody's more organized and more powerful than Israel is at this time. The people cry out for help, and in response, God raises up a deliverer, to restore them to peace and stability and proper behavior. And then the deliverer, or the judge, eventually dies, and the people devolve into idolatry again, and the cycle begins all over. So this happens 12 times in the book of Judges. They are not getting the message, trying and failing over and over again. But each time the cycle repeats, society becomes more disjointed, and the cycle just kind of falls apart, becomes incomplete. And by the time we reach chapter 16, the cycle has completely fallen apart, and society is in absolute chaos. Now, the judges that are described in the book of Judges, what do you get a picture in your head when we say judge? What's the picture? Black robe, sitting on a bench, a lot of education, he's got a gavel. Old. Scholarly, I don't know. So that is not necessarily what a judge is in this case. The word judge that is translated into English has more nuances to it than we have with the word judge. So biblical judges had this broad role in the life of the community. They were entrusted to deliver the people from oppression. They would be military leaders. And then they were trying to ensure that the people were practicing their covenant with God, that they were worshiping God alone and not the gods of the other people around them. Deborah was unique among all the judges portrayed in the book, partly because she was a woman, but also because she was the only judge who actually performed a judicial function. She was settling disputes. She would sit under a palm tree, and people would come to her with their problems, with their issues, with their disputes, and she would help resolve them. None of the other judges is described as doing this. She was a national leader, a self-described mother of Israel, as well as a military leader. And she was one of only 2 judges who's described as being a prophet. More hints about Deborah's nature and her importance to the community are in her name and how she's described. As Allison mentioned, the name Deborah has traditionally been translated as bee or wasp, a stinging insect. But the consonants that make up her name are an anagram. They can also be mixed up to create the root word for the words speak and word. which is an appropriate name for a prophet. And she's also described as being the wife of Lapidot, which might be factual, but it may also be symbolic, because the word that's translated as wife, eshet, also means woman. There's no differentiation there, eshet. So the word Lapidot could indeed be a man's name, but it also means flames. So this wife of Lapidot may actually mean woman of fire. Poetically, this makes sense, not only because of her fiery nature, but also because the name Barak means lightning. Fire, lightning. They are appropriate counterparts for each other. Throughout the story, Deborah is unfailingly knowledgeable, brave, and confident. And unlike other women portrayed in the Hebrew Bible, such as Miriam from last week's sermon, she is never put in her place by either men or God. She leads ably, and she's unopposed throughout her story, and her leadership is successful. Deborah's story ends by saying that the land was at peace for 40 years. And yet, as I said before, patriarchy has difficult time dealing with strong, capable, powerful women, and the rabbinic interpreters of the Torah through the ages have labeled Deborah as arrogant, haughty, and boastful. Rabbi Hillel, who was an influential Jewish scholar from the 1st century, said that she, in a midrash, a story about her, said that she was punished and the Holy Spirit was taken from her because she boasted, "I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel." A later scholar, Rav Nachman, from the 19th century, said that her name was hateful because she was arrogant. A feminist Jewish scholar, Leila Leah Bronner, notes that in the historic Jewish biblical interpretation and commentary, not one sage came to her defense or suggests a different interpretation. And this is not in keeping with Talmudic discussion, Jewish interpretation, because usually there are pro and con arguments. One guy says, well, this is what it means, and another one will say, no, I think it's this. There is none of that in the Talmudic literature about Deborah. They just criticize her, and that's it. Now Yael, too, who delivers the final blow to Israel's oppressors by killing the general Sisera with his tent stake through the skull, has often also been criticized and condemned by interpreters of the book of Judges. She's most often accused of violating the sacred customs of Near Eastern hospitality. It was important that when someone came into your tent, you offered them hospitality. But if we take a closer look at her part of the story, we realize that it is Sisera himself who has violated the customs of hospitality. Sisera should have come to Yael's husband, or the leader of the household, to ask for asylum. He should not have entered Yael's tent. This violation of custom and ritual quite likely alerted Yael to the fact that something was wrong, something was amiss. And it's also not a far stretch to imagine that Sisera, alone in Yael's tent, may have asked Yael for more than a drink of water and a place to rest. And for every woman ever abused by a man, Yael's action feels like she has driven a tent stake through the skull of patriarchy itself. It's violent, but I cheer when I read it. Deborah and Yael and the entire book of Judges deserve to be lifted out of obscurity. For in confronting humanity's ancient tendency toward violence and chaos, we can recommit ourselves to follow God's path to justice and peace. And in studying the stories of these extraordinary women, we can recognize and support the women of extraordinary courage and power who are working tirelessly to change our world in this time and place.